This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China snubs Japan's bid to calm tensions over Taiwan, demanding a retraction of remarks by Prime Minister Takaichi. Beijing also confirms that Premier Li Qiang will not be meeting the Japanese leader during the upcoming G20 summit. Now, as tensions between the Asian economic heavyweights simmer, Japanese retailers, tourists, and investors are feeling the heat. Stocks slide sharply. Japan also having to deal with the impact of U.S. tariffs. Its economy shrinks for the first time in 6 quarters. And also another first for the Takaichi cabinet, a crucial 2+2 meeting with Indonesia's foreign and defense ministers aiming to deepen maritime cooperation and push for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Also in the bulletin, Thailand's king winding up a historic visit to China that saw deals on cooperation in emerging fields such as AI and the digital economy. China says that it will continue to protest remarks by Japan's new leader, Sanae Takaichi, that Tokyo may intervene in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Beijing says the comment has seriously damaged the foundation of their relations.
我想强调的是，针对日本首相高市早苗的涉台错误言论，中方已经并将继续向日方提出严正交涉和强烈抗议，严肃要求日方立即反思纠错，收回错误言论，停止在涉华问题上制造事端。
Now, at the same time, or rather at the same briefing, the ministry said Premier Li Qiang has no plans to meet with the Japanese leader at the G20 summit in South Africa. Japan, meantime, has sent an envoy to China to tamp down the row. Senior diplomat Maasaki Kanai is in Beijing and will meet his Chinese counterpart to explain that Ms. Takaichi's comment does not signal a shift in Japan's security policy and urge China to refrain from further damaging ties. Well, Beijing, expressing its displeasure, issued a second warning to its citizens to avoid traveling to Japan for safety reasons. China is the biggest source of travelers to Japan, making up almost 30% of all tourist spending. Beijing also urged its citizens to reconsider studying in Japan.
留学や観光を含む2国間の人的交流、これを萎縮させるかのような、今回の発表につきましては、首脳間で確認した戦略的互恵関係の推進、あるいは建設的かつ安定的な関係の構築、そういった大きな方向性とも相入れないものだと考えております。中国側に対してはこうした点につき申し入れを行い、適切な対応を強く求めたところであります。
Japan separately lodged a protest with China after Chinese Coast Guard vessels sailed near Senkaku Islands, also known as the Diaoyu Islands. They're controlled by Tokyo, but also claimed by Beijing. China calling it a lawful patrol, Japan saying it's an unacceptable intrusion. A territorial dispute over the uninhabited islands in 2012 led to a major diplomatic crisis between the two countries and remains still today a source of tensions. Now, Taiwanese President William Lai, commenting on the row today, said that China had severely impacted regional peace and called on Beijing to show, quote, restraint and not become the troublemaker in the region. Well, CNA's correspondent Deborah Wong joins us live now from Shenzhen. Deborah, what is the immediate impact on the ground following China's warnings about traveling and studying in Japan?
So immediately on Chinese social media like Xiaohongshu or even Weibo, we are seeing netizens, raise questions as to whether it's still safe to travel to Japan for studies or for leisure. Some have already indicated that they've booked trips since months ago and they're worried that, they are not going to be able to get some refunds or rebookings. Netizens, have responded to these posts, advising them to follow the government's travel advisory, discouraging them from going, some even raising points about nationalism. We had a chat with some people on the streets earlier this morning. Have a listen.
对于日本的这个行为吧，我是觉着他对于我们影响我们这个台湾的问题，我觉着还是挺抵制的。如果说是对于去他的这个，由于这个行为，我觉得相对我来说，肯定是不会去选择去日本旅游的。
其实有很多人可能他计划了很久 ，plan 了很久，然后可能也存了很多，就是花了一段时间存钱，那才能买机票、订酒店，想要去这个日本之行。那如果说突然之间，因为一些原因去不了了，那其实对于很多打工一族来说，也是很难受嘛。这个突然之间，存了一大笔积蓄，如果不能退的话，那就很惨。那这个航司啊，跟旅行社啊，就是呼应这个国家的号召，那也是为人民着想嘛，我觉得非常好。
So you just heard from the resident, several Chinese travel agencies as well as multiple Chinese airlines have followed the travel advisory, in effect, encouraging it, facilitating that to offer free cancellations or free rebookings for netizens, for citizens who are affected by, the travel advisory. But there are also other people on social media that have noted that Japan remains a relatively safe destination. I did see a post on Xiaohongshu of a Chinese traveler who's currently in the Kanto region, and she says that she's observed many Chinese nationals working in the Japanese service sector there, and because her interactions with them have been relatively pleasant, she does feel some sense of security. But beyond tourism, 2 Japanese movies scheduled for release in China have also been postponed, and it's likely due to the ongoing spat. In fact, when you scroll down the comments, people are saying that even if it's released, they would boycott the movie. Now, collectively, these reactions do highlight the very layered situation that we are seeing play out between the 2 countries. Japanese media reporting that a senior diplomat is traveling to China today to quell the situation with Beijing, and he's expected to convey the position that differences between both sides should avoid impacting people-to-people exchanges. Now, China, once again, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs briefing today, reiterating, urging Japan to retract the wrong words. So it seems that as long as this retraction is not made, this acknowledgement of comments is not made, the bilateral situation will remain frosty.
So in the meantime, though, retraction is not made, but how real are the risks of economic retribution against Japan? Because China's state media, they're already threatening more countermeasures.
Right. So the commentary that we've seen on state media has warned, that China may suspend government-level exchanges with Japan across areas like the economy, diplomacy, as well as military. And China being one of Japan's largest trading partners means that Beijing does hold some sort of leverage, in terms of economic restrictions. Now, we take a look at tourism first. I've just spoken about how there is some impact playing out on social media in terms of, real-world examples. We've seen that Chinese make up the biggest group of foreign visitors to Japan in the first 9 months of 2025. Official Japanese data show that nearly 7.5 million travelers from China to Japan, were there in the first half of this year. And trip cancellations, with them streaming in, there will be a significant dent on Japanese tourism economy. Aside from that, the broader economy has also taken quite a hard hit. Just today, we've seen tourism and retail-related stocks dropping sharply on Monday. Shiseido marking an 11.4% plunge, and ANA, or airlines holdings, slumped 3.8%. So the risks are quite real. We also do need to take a look at the situation between South Korea and China back in 2017 to just try to understand what could play out in the next couple of months. Back in 2017, China did object to the South Korean deployment of that U.S. anti-missile system, saying back then that it could monitor parts of China's airspace. And back then we did see an unofficial ban on K-pop, on K-drama. Lotte Group faced immense boycotts, eventually having to exit the market. So, as long as the bilateral relations remain frosty, these risks could be coming very, very soon, the next couple of months. Otelli.
Right, we'll be looking out for that. Thanks so very much. CNA's correspondent, Deborah Wong in Shenzhen. Well, we've got Olivia Marzuki standing by with market reaction to the latest diplomatic row over Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's comments on Taiwan. And Olivia, I want to get your thoughts here on this. China is the biggest source of tourists to Japan and, of course, contributing billions of dollars to the economy. So in a nutshell, today, how have the markets reacted?
Well, not too positively, I can say this, Oteli. So basically, the shares of Japanese tourism and retail-related stocks took a beating after China warned its citizens to avoid the tourist spots and hotspots, stoking fears that the wave of Chinese revenue may stop. So retailers were the major drag on markets today. They're seen mostly as beneficiaries of the Chinese tourist spending. So we saw double-digit drop for beauty giant Shiseido, and also department store operators Isetan, Mitsukoshi, as well as Takashimaya, 6% down there, Isetan 11%, and Ryohin Keikaku, the owner of a lifestyle retail store, Muji. It's down nearly 10% at the closing bell. Holiday and travel names not spared either. Tokyo Disneyland operator was not the happiest place on earth today. It is tanking by about 5%. Shares of airlines losing much altitude in trade as well. ANA Holdings, the operator of all Nippon Airways 3% down, and also Japan Airlines there more than 3.7% down. I'll have more details on tourism-related trade between the two countries, China and Japan, in just a while. For now, it's back to you, Oteli.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Olivia. Chat with you in a short bit. In the meantime, we'll also be getting more insights on the diplomatic spat when we speak with Grant Newsham, Senior Research Fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies. That's happening later this hour. Japan and Indonesia are holding a 2+2 meeting of their foreign and defense ministers in Tokyo. This will be the third such meeting between the sides and the first of its kind since Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi launched her cabinet last month. Well, the two nations are expected to share views on the global situation and discuss ways to strengthen cooperation between the maritime and defense sectors. A free and open Indo-Pacific also topping talks. Japan's defense minister last week stressed that the geopolitical significance of Indonesia, describing Japan-Indonesia ties as indispensable. Both defense chiefs will be visiting a Japanese maritime self-defense forces base on the sidelines. And for more, we are joined by CNA's Indonesia correspondent Chatni Vatvani live from Jakarta. Chatni, this is the third 2+2 ministerial level dialogue to be held. In a nutshell, what can we expect from the discussions?
Well, according to reports, we can expect to see pledges of commitments in maritime security. Indonesia and Japan are both expected to affirm their shared commitment to strengthening bilateral relations through the Official Security Assistance Framework, under which Japan provides defense equipment assistance to partner countries. Now, there's also talk of the two countries discussing the possibility of jointly developing a naval fleet during this dialogue. And Indonesia's political advisor to the Ministry of Defense previously said that bilateral defense ties have grown significantly in recent years to encompass strategic dialogues, personnel exchanges, joint education and training programs, combined exercises, and collaboration in the industry. However, there is potential for expanding collaboration, particularly in defense technology through joint research, innovation, professional exchanges, and integrated training. So Indonesian Foreign Minister Sugiono previously also emphasized that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will focus on political discussions, while the Ministry of Defense will highlight security and defense issues. And so we will be keeping an eye on the joint statement that we are expecting a little later to see what both countries will be collaborating on.
Now, also, China, Indonesia has traditionally maintained a stance of active neutrality. Essentially, what does this mean for Jakarta with its military dealings with other nations?
That's right. Traditionally, Indonesia has adopted a free and active foreign policy whilst remaining independent and neutral. And officials say that this allows Indonesia to determine national policies without having to deal with external pressure. Now, this stance also allows Indonesia to pursue foreign policy initiatives that are aligned with its own domestic interests. And this means that Indonesia continues to maintain relations with other countries and major powers as well. For example, Earlier this year, in April, Indonesia also held a 2+2 meeting with China. Now, it's also worth noting that in Foreign Minister Sugiono's first ever policy speech, the minister reiterated the country's principle of free and active foreign policy, but he did also signal that Indonesia would be actively pursuing its own domestic goals through foreign policy.
Well, thanks for that report. CNA's Indonesia correspondent Chatni Vatvani speaking to us live from Jakarta. We are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Japan's GDP marking its first contraction in 6 quarters. And South Korea's biggest conglomerates pledge billions to keep the country's industrial engine revving. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. It is now time to get you up to speed in business, and Olivia Mazuki, as promised, is standing by for more. We were talking earlier about the diplomatic spat between, Japan and China, and now there are fears of Chinese tourists and the spending tied to it dropping, and it's making Japanese investors jittery. Is that right?
Indeed, Oteli, because China, as we know, is the #1 source of tourism dollar for Japan. So the fear is real. A major sell-off we saw today ripped through major stocks in Japan's retail and transport sectors. An economic fallout threatens to make things worse for Asia's second largest economy, which shrank by 0.4% in the third quarter. Chinese visitors are Japan's largest source of foreign tourists, with nearly 7.5 million arrivals in the first 9 months of this year, accounting for nearly a third of all tourism receipts. As weaker yen makes shopping cheaper, they collectively splurged more than $11 billion in Japan last year. A leading economic think tank has warned a sharp drop in Chinese visitors could reduce overall tourism spending by an annual $14 billion. Well, Chinese nationals also account for more than a third of international students in Japan, at more than 123,000 last year. Tuition fees for international students range from $5,300 to more than $20,000 per academic year. The impact of U.S. tariffs beginning to reflect in Japan's growth. The economy contracted in the third quarter, marking its first decline in 6 months as higher duties hit exports and housing investment plunged. GDP shrank almost 2% in the 3 months through September. Still, the decline is not as acute as expected. Analysts were expecting a drop of 2.4%. The contraction in the last quarter reverses an expansion of 2.3% in the second quarter, which boosted largely by tariff-related front-loading. This time around, net exports cut 0.2 percentage points off from the country's GDP. Most economists viewing this quarter's GDP figures as having a marginal impact on Bank of Japan's policy decision. Meanwhile, some analysts say a weaker growth figure could give Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi a stronger case to compile a major economic stimulus. Ms. Takaichi has already signaled a shift towards a more expansionary fiscal policy. Her administration is reportedly preparing a stimulus package of about $110 billion. The Nikkei reports that spending plan is expected to be approved by Japan's cabinet on November the 21st. Let's check on markets and equity markets in Japan in reaction to that GDP figure and a worsening diplomatic rift with China. The Nikkei 225 ending the day managing to pull back some of the losses, but still in the red, 0.1%. And the Japanese yen is hovering at levels around 154.74 to the greenback. South Korea's conglomerates say they will invest more than $500 billion at home over the next 5 years. This is an effort to ease public concerns that the country's manufacturing base could be hollowed out following Seoul's investment pledges to Washington. Samsung says it plans to spend more than $300 billion. Meanwhile, Hyundai pledging some $86 billion. The two conglomerates say that the money will be spent on AI, semiconductors, and clean energy. And it comes after a meeting with President Lee Jae-myung yesterday.
Although the pledges are nearly a third of the country's annual output, analysts say that many of the commitments are already part of earlier spending plans. Now, concerns rose after Seoul finalized a $350 billion pledge with Washington in return for lower tariffs. The Yi administration is keen to temper public fears that the deal will shift domestic production out of the country. Staying in South Korea, shares there on the rise today as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix jumped following their pledge to beef up domestic investment. The benchmark Kospi index closed almost 2% firmer. It is bucking the trend in Asia, is the clear outperformer in the region today. And the 1 weekend at the moment is at a 1,460 level to the greenback. And chipmaker Samsung Electronics rose 3.5% and its peer SK Hynix gained more than 8%. China and Hong Kong equities ended the day down. Investors turned cautious on heightened tensions between Beijing and Tokyo over the weekend and opted to book profits following a recent rally. Shanghai Composite Index lost about 0.5%. Shenzhen Component ending the day marginally lower, and Hong Kong's benchmark Hang Seng Index slipped about 0.7%. So far this year, though, the Hang Seng Index has gained around 34%. Austria-based printed circuit board and substrate maker AT&S is expanding in Malaysia as global demand rises for advanced components used in supercomputers and artificial intelligence systems. CNA's Melissa Goh caught up with the company's new CEO, Dr. Michael Merton, in Kuala Lumpur, where he outlined plans for further investment.
This market is growing extremely fast now, and they need the products coming from Malaysia, and most of the customers want to be supplied out of Malaysia. So this is a challenge for both, for our supply chain. The first building we already equipped, 100% volume from the first plant we are utilizing now. And we are thinking about starting in the second stage of our investment.
Give us, in terms of dollar and cents, how much has been invested in Malaysia so far and how much will be pumping in within the next year or so as you ramp up your production?
We already invested a little bit more than 1.2 billion euros so far. We have another commitment of around about 500 million euros. Part of it actually is implemented now. And the remaining part of these 500 is part of our investment plan for the closer, nearer upcoming future. We are profitable now on the EBIT side, so we have a lot of cash flow positively to further invest into Kulim and other high-end sites. But Kulim definitely is a center for upcoming investments.
Do you foresee a talent gap in Malaysia? Do you foresee problem staffing because of a shortage of skilled workers?
This is more and more definitely an issue. We have 2,100 employees here in Malaysia, and roughly 1/4 of it is high-skill jobs. So white-collar jobs, jobs in the technical environment, TDI, technical support and development. Definitely for Malaysia is, if you want to formally grow in high-tech area, please take care for higher-ed education as well, and it starts very early in school, so that kids are interested for technology, for mathematics, for engineering. And of course, you need high-class universities as well, most probably relatively close to these investment hotspots.
Will AT&S be able to maintain its double-digit growth going forward? And where are the major drivers for growth for AT&S?
The strongest growth is what we see with products which are manufactured also here. So with the substrates for the supercomputers, this growth is beyond 20% year over year, and we expect this kind of growth to be continued. So our expectation for the next fiscal year will be in the range of 2.1 up to 2.4 billion euros.
But what keeps you up at night?
It is definitely the uncertainty of the U.S. foreign politics and the U.S. trade politics. It's not that much the tariffs, because we are not delivering directly to the United States, so our customers mostly further integrate their products somewhere in Asia, not in the U.S. So this tariff war is something what is not really affecting us. It's the uncertainty where products should be produced and where to further invest.
How do you navigate all these challenges amid the superpower rivalries? If the geopolitical uncertainty were to escalate, what are the measures that you can use, AT&S will be employing to adapt to the situation, to remain resilient?
We are in a pretty good situation that we can react quite quickly, if necessary, for further demand out of a country like Malaysia, what is still highly accepted. But we also have the subsidiary in Austria for certain products. Additionally, we already have started a China for China strategy. So we set up a dedicated sales team, a dedicated technology team, and already gather customer in China.
How long do you take before China catches up in terms of technology?
I think for mainstream and volume technology, this will not take so long. Maybe it takes a longer time for the absolute high-end supercomputing and the absolute high-end artificial intelligence.
All right, I'll tell you, that's all I have in business for now. Back to you.
Thanks so very much for that business report, Olivia. All right, it's time now for another break, but coming up in East Asia tonight, Japan's latest attempt to de-escalate a row with China over Taiwan rebuffed. How will this impact the two neighbors' economic interests? And the Thai King wraps up his 5-day visit to China that Bangkok says underlines its deep-rooted friendship with Beijing. Hello again, this is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Japan hosts Indonesia for a meeting of foreign and defense ministers, with both sides looking to find ways to strengthen defense cooperation and push for a free and open Indo-Pacific. China says its premier will not be meeting Japan's prime minister at the G20 summit that begins this Saturday, and that it will continue to protest remarks by Sanae Takaichi that Beijing says has seriously damaged the foundation of relations. Now, that China-Japan dispute spilling into the markets, Japanese tourism and retail shares diving after China warned its citizens to avoid the tourist hotspot. Right, and for more insights into this escalating diplomatic row, let's bring in Grant Newsham, Senior Research Fellow, Japan Forum for Strategic Studies. Well, thanks for joining us yet again this evening. So let's just start with, let's start wide with this big picture question. Japan says it isn't changing a policy, but Beijing's acting as if it has. What is the real shift here, Grant?
Well, the real shift is China becoming more aggressive. Everything the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, does is pretextual. They have an excuse to do something that they want to do. They've got about as much emotion as a white shark and an appetite to boot. So Takaichi said nothing that was not already either said or well known. But this is an excuse for the Chinese communists to act offended, to turn up the military heat, the diplomatic heat, the psychological heat on Japan and on the new Prime Minister Takaichi. As I said, it's entirely concocted. This will be as serious as China wants to make it.
So, I mean, we've seen, right? I mean, China's travel warning has already hit sentiment. We've got tourism, retail sliding. And how far, I mean, do you think this can escalate? I mean, if you recall back in 2012, 2013, there were all these anti-Japan protests and boycotts over the Senkaku and Diaoyu dispute. So what is the worst case scenario here?
Well, the worst case scenario, I would say, would be China, say, attacking or shooting at a Japanese ship down in the Senkaku Islands, perhaps landing on the Senkakus. In other words, getting physical with the Japanese. These protests in China, they are turned on and turned off at will. That's always been the case. As I said, there's nothing that Takaichi said or did that was unusual or should have surprised the People's Republic of China. But this is very much in line with their objectives, is to ultimately dominate the PRC. It's sort of ironic that the person who asked Takaichi these questions in the Diet, Okada Katsuya, his family has extensive business interests in China. And this is not the first time that he has done things to try and get the Japanese government in a difficult spot when it comes to defending itself.
Well, if cooler heads prevail here, I mean, we're seeing that Tokyo, is trying to bring down tensions. It's sending a senior diplomat to Beijing, even though this G20 meeting is not happening between Li Qiang and Ms. Takaichi. So, Grant, what does de-escalation look like? What are some of the signals we should be looking out for?
Well, I don't know that there's really going to be de-escalation. What you would see is in the sense that Chinese objectives have never changed, never will, unless they're presented with just a complete obstacle they can't get around. But it all depends on China toning down the rhetoric. But as long as they're saying things or allowing their consuls to say things like Takaichi's head should be cut off, and then the government and other Chinese government officials doubling down on this, well, it's going to keep getting worse and worse. So to de-escalate, it is going to require, I think, the PRC to eventually back off a bit. It is ironic that the tourism and the Chinese student cutoff that they've threatened. Well, I think actually, if you look at the polls, most Japanese would actually be glad to see that. China has done something the Americans have never been able to get the Japanese to do, and that is to take their defense seriously. So Washington ought to send a thank you note to Xi Jinping for his services here.
Right, and on the deterrence fundamentals, I think Beijing is now also questioning, Japan's non-nuclear stance and hints at their ambiguity. I mean, is anyone in Tokyo actually seriously talking about nuclear sharing or maybe putting some kind of quick strike, missiles in place?
Oh, in a Japanese kind of way, the idea is being considered, but it's been considered for a long time. It takes place below the surface. It's nowhere close to sort of any sort of concrete changes, but it is being thought about. It's all being done in response to a very severe security situation, as the Japanese will put it, and it's all caused by the PRC. The Japanese have been very clear about this. If you look at their defense white papers, their national security strategies, they have been clear that this is where the threat comes from. It's a threat they face, and that they're going to defend themselves. But in terms of any shift in nuclear policy, it happens very, very gradually, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But all of this is driving the Japanese even much closer to the Americans than they already were, and that was pretty close.
Yeah, but at home, though, I mean, the politics itself, I mean, the polls, they're giving Ms. Takaichi the support. You see, about half of the people, they're backing this helping if a Taiwan crisis happens. But, that support, I mean, is it going to hold, or it depends on the economy, whether if prices are affected or jobs are hit?
Well, it always depends. But I think you'll find, and this goes back well over a decade, actually longer, that when they conduct a serious poll about what Japanese public thinking is, the vast majority, we're talking 80, 90%, consider a proper national defense to be common sense. And they really have no objections to that when it's explained to them. And also when you go back and look at polls as to what the sort of feeling is towards China, it's generally been pretty negative. And this goes back a long ways. In the Japanese political class, of course, Chinese political warfare has been very effective. So you do have a large number of Japanese politicians who are effectively proxies of the PRC, unfortunately. But when it comes to public opinion, that has always been supportive of a national defense. And the greater and more obvious the threat appears, the more you're going to see Japanese support for it. Of course, like a lot of things, it does depend on what happens. Nobody quite knows. But this is one situation where the Chinese have turned up the heat. And the objective is ultimately to dominate Japan, to control it, if not occupy it, but certainly to take some Japanese territory. And they're just doing to Japan what they've done to the Philippines, they've done to the Koreans, the Vietnamese as well. So this is really something, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but the intensity of the venom directed at Takaichi, the things that were said and were backed up by the Chinese government. This is not how a civilized nation behaves. What will Japan do? They certainly quietly seethe, they always do, will go about defending themselves, building up their defenses, strengthening ties with the Americans and everyone else that they possibly can.
All right, we'll certainly be looking out for signals in the markets, travel, and possibly at sea as well. It's always good talking to you. Thank you so very much. Grant Newsham, Senior Research Fellow, Japan Forum for Strategic Studies. In other news, Taiwan will begin distributing millions of copies of a civil defense handbook to residents this week. That includes new instructions on what to do if citizens encounter enemy soldiers. Well, the unprecedented addition comes amid simmering cross-strait tensions as Beijing continues to step up military and political pressure over the self-ruled island. Now, the handbook outlines scenarios Taiwan might face to prepare residents for potential emergencies. And these range from natural disasters to cyber attacks and even an all-out invasion. A senior official overseeing the distribution says the book shows Taiwan's determination to defend itself, while warning that the island is already facing hybrid warfare by China that includes military incursions and misinformation campaigns. Thailand's King Maha Vajiralongkorn is wrapping up his visit to China 4 days after President Xi Jinping rolled out the red carpet for the monarch. Now, the visit was at the invitation of the Chinese leader to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the sides establishing diplomatic ties in 1975. Bangkok says the trip underlined the deep-rooted friendship between the two countries. China's president, meanwhile, pledged to strengthen strategic alignment with Thailand. Xi said that cooperation would be expanded on a China-Thailand railway link, as well as in artificial intelligence, aerospace, and the digital economy. China is Thailand's biggest trading partner and increasingly a rival to the U.S. as a source of military equipment. A CNA correspondent, Saksit Sasambat, joins us from Bangkok for the very latest. Saksit, the royal visit, what does that mean for China-Thailand relations?
It is a significant event for both countries, with His Majesty King Maha Vajiralongkorn and also Queen Suthida on this weekend trip to China, not only celebrating a golden jubilee, 50 years of diplomatic relations between both countries, but also for Beijing, it is an opportunity to underline its reaffirmation about its commitment of its relations to the Southeast Asian nation as well. And the itinerary, when you look at it, is also pretty stacked as well. Not only meetings and banquets with leaders, and not only with Chinese President Xi Jinping, but also with other leaders of the Communist Party, as well as many visits to cultural and science sites that are important to both countries, especially since the royal couple, his and her Majesty, are being seen as patrons of the arts and culture and religion here in Thailand. But what's also significant is who else was in the delegation, as it is customary. High-ranking cabinet ministers are also required to travel along with the King and Queen as well. So Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul was on this trip as well, accompanying their Majesties on this trip. What's also very interesting is that in a statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, it says here that China is the first major country that the royals have visited. However, it has to be said, this is not the first country ever that the royal couple has visited. His Majesty King Maha Vajiralongkorn has visited Bhutan earlier this year. That was the first trip ever since he was crowned in 2019. So as you can see, that this has been a weekend full of bilateral celebrations for both countries, but also in the background a strengthening of these ties between both countries, especially when it comes to geopolitical considerations.
So tell us more about that. I mean, Thailand, how is it trying to position itself on the world stage, especially when we've got superpowers like China and the US that are becoming increasingly confrontational?
Now, that balancing act is not new, but it seems to be that it has become a more challenging one over the years as well, especially under U.S. President Donald Trump, who has not only been waging a tariff war on many countries, including Thailand, but also its role in the Thai-Cambodian border conflict, which is a pretty good illustration about how different China and the United States are seeing themselves as their role in this region. Now, even in the beginning of this armed conflicts, both China and the United States have been involved and trying to mediate between the countries, as well as also ASEAN chair and Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim also was part of it. But over the course of the weeks, especially during the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur last month, China was didn't have a visible active role letting U.S. President Donald Trump oversee the signing of a peace declaration between the both countries, even though that has come under incredible strain, causing Donald Trump to come in again to make assessments and also assertments against both countries, especially against Thailand, while this was all happening when Prime Minister Anutin and also his foreign ministers were in Beijing, accompanying the king and queen at that time as well. So a lot of backdoor diplomacy and also background diplomacy was needed for the Thai government leaders at that time. But it is also an important factor for Beijing in this weekend, also in general, to show itself as a more reliable partner, not only to Thailand, but also to other countries as well. Whether or not this has been successful, that of course remains to be seen, but it is being seen as a milestone between both countries here, especially not only politically, but also in economically and also in many other factors as well.
Oh, many thanks for that, CNA correspondent in Bangkok, Saksit Saisombat. We are going to go for another break now, but coming up on a bulletin, how one nation is taking big strides to expand its forest land as the UN Climate Change Conference in Brazil enters its second week. And one of Japan's most active volcanoes erupts for a second straight day, sending plumes of smoke and ash kilometers into the air. It's the second week of the UN Climate Conference, with world leaders, activists and experts gathering in Brazil. Among those countries and regions that have pledged to cut greenhouse gas emissions, the European Union aiming for a 90% reduction by 2040. It's a deal that reflects at its core a concern over the continued ability of Europe's forests to act as carbon sinks. William Denslow files this report for CNA from Denmark, a nation taking strides to expand its forest land.
Once used for agriculture, this area near the Danish city of Aarhus is being converted into forests, part of a $6 billion government push to convert 10% of farmland into natural habitat. The idea is to cut the use of fertilisers that seep into the groundwater and severely deplete oxygen levels, harming marine life. Mads Flinterup is the head of climate and biodiversity for the nature management firm Helderskaper. He says this afforestation plan will breathe fresh life to Danish waters and to the country's climate ambitions.
If we take the carbon-rich soils and make them wet again, then we will have better carbon sequestration in them. And where we do afforestation, the trees will sequester the carbon, and that will also mitigate the climate crisis.
The European Union has pledged more than $700 million to support landowners who participate in this environmental transition.
Through projects like this, the Danish authorities plan to plant 1 billion trees over the next 2 decades. This scheme is slowly taking root, but the European Union's anti-deforestation plans are struggling to get off the ground.
Back in 2023, the EU adopted a landmark proposal that would ensure palm oil and other imported commodities are sourced from vendors that don't contribute to deforestation. But implementation has stalled, with the new law at risk of further delay, or worse, put on the chopping block. Some lawmakers want more time to mitigate disruptions and avoid economic shocks. But Helena Wright, Policy Director at the investor network Fair Initiative, says this uncertainty is harmful for trade and the environment.
A lot of people are emphasising, obviously, the geopolitical context and security are coming up as big issues. But there was a lot of people from the business community and others pointing out we need to maintain the focus on climate and on deforestation, and we need to maintain those.
Uncertainty is also a criticism levelled at the EU's 2040 target to cut 90% of carbon emissions compared to 1990 levels, largely because of so-called flexibilities, such as the break clause, to soften the target should Europe's forests fail to absorb enough carbon dioxide to compensate for industrial pollution. In the past decade, climate impacts and increased logging have caused the amount of CO2 absorbed by trees to fall by a third. Proponents say they're being ambitious while staying pragmatic. But Lena Schilling, a member of the European Parliament for the Green Party, calls it a weakening of the bloc's climate credentials.
What we do is not to take the ambition to strengthen our forests, to have the deforestation regulation, to have forest monitoring. No, we just weaken our own targets and then be like, yeah, but with the forests we have a problem. So just weaken the targets and not take action, and that's so senseless. You could never explain it to a child or your daughter or whomever.
Schilling is among lawmakers pressing for the bloc to deliver on commitments it's already made. Meanwhile, countries like Denmark are forging ahead with their own climate initiatives, hoping to keep Europe's broader environmental targets on the right path. For CNA, I'm William Denslow in Aarhus, Denmark.
For more of our coverage on COP30 as well as related climate stories, do log on to cna.asia or our mobile app. Japan has issued more warnings of ash fall after one of the country's most active volcanoes erupted again today. Sakurajima, situated on Kyushu Island, spewed smoke and ash up to 2.4 kilometers into the air when it erupted at about 6 a.m. local time this morning. Well, the latest eruption comes after 3 earlier ones on Sunday that sent ash more than 4 kilometers into the sky. Local media reported 30 flights in and out of Kagoshima Airport yesterday were cancelled due to the volcanic activity. Authorities have advised residents to protect themselves from ash by using umbrellas and masks and to drive slowly if visibility drops. The alert for Sakurajima remains at level 3, which limits access to the mountain but doesn't call for evacuations. In sports, North Korea's under-17 women's football team has returned home to a warm welcome over the weekend after winning the 2025 FIFA Women's World Cup in Morocco earlier this month. State media KCNA reports that the players were received by the sports minister, officials and their family members at Pyongyang International Airport on Saturday. North Korea defeated the Netherlands 3-0 in the final of the under-17 Women's World Cup on 9th of November. A feat hailed by the nation's media as a clear demonstration of what it describes as the world's strongest team. The win is the team's second consecutive championship and their fourth title.
우리가 응당해야 할 일을 한 우리들을 이렇게 환대해주는 저 외 인민들과 부모를 사랑하는 부모님들을 만나니 정말 눈물이 나옵니다. 앞으로 훈련을 더 잘해서 월드컵을 영원한 조선의 월드컵으로 만드는데 이바지하겠다는 것을 굳게 결의합니다.
A Bangladesh court has sentenced former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to death for crimes against humanity over a deadly crackdown she ordered against student-led protests that led to her ouster. Now, reacting to the verdict, Hasina called the trial biased and politically motivated. The proceedings were held in her absence. The 78-year-old former leader fled to India after she failed to put down the uprising. The UN estimates up to 1,400 people died during the crackdown last year. And, of course, we'll have more in Asia tonight, about an hour from now, 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. And that wraps up Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.